There is something about being born and raised in mountains that shapes you, I think, and leaves you with a permanent attachment to the landscape and maybe to the ways of being among people. So that certainly had a lot to do with my ongoing ties. And I've been lucky because I've been able to return to Kentucky against all the rules, Thomas Wolfe's rule, in which he says you can't go home again. He couldn't. That seems to have been his personal problem. But I don't think it hasn't been my problem at all. I was born in 1937, and I lived at LA's till 46 for the most part. And it was extremely busy and active and vital place. It was a community. In the middle of it was the company commissary, and just up the tracks a ways from the commissary was this enormous coal tipple. The coal was coming out of underground and going into this very large tipple, and underneath it were the coal guns that were being filled one by one as they would make the train. And there was the sound of the tipple working all day, separating the coal and dropping it into these big coal guns, and the screech of brakes on the coal cars as they would move them to make the train, and trucks coming down out of the hollow from the tipple, hauling the slate and dumping it on the pile there by the riverbank. So there's this coal trucks and railroad cars and coal and workmen going to work. A shift would go to work, and you'd see all these miners walking to work. And then at the end of the day, off they would come, and my father worked either on the tipple or sometimes underground. And the men during the work week would have coal dust all over them and be in work clothes. And on Saturday, though, it would change. Usually there wouldn't be work, as I remember, and everybody would gather at the commissary. So on this kind of lawn in front of the commissary on Saturdays, I remember 100 people in clean clothes and glad to be to have a day off and to be cleaned up and ready to visit and socialize, and a little bit of the feeling that you get from any shopping center you would get in the front of the commissary, people coming and going and carrying bags of groceries and stuff, but socializing too, hanging out in front of the commissary in a very pleasant way. And for me, I was a little kid underfoot, and I loved to be around the men. I loved to be with my father as he would stand and talk with his workmen fellows. They would just be standing and talking, and they would tease me and make me laugh, and I felt very included in the situation. And I really felt that there was no more natural place to be than in LA's coal camp. I didn't have any sense that the school's reading program had any awareness of Kentucky writers or regional writers at all. I didn't know anything about that, with one exception. My English teacher in high school, Miss Ellis, this was at Stuart Robinson School at Blackie when I was a boarding student. Miss Ellis was an admirer of Jesse Stewart, and some of Jesse Stewart's stories were anthologized and were in our readers. The famous one is called Split Cherry Tree. It's a famous story. And I got the idea. Miss Ellis explained to us that Mr. Stewart was a Kentuckian and that he lived not so far away. Once I understood that a story in a book had been written by someone from Kentucky, this opened a whole new window in my thinking. I thought, wow, I never thought of that. And it really meant something to me. Before I had this insight, I didn't miss it. I was satisfied with Gene Autry and Tom Sawyer. It was all right. But this was special. This really immediately had something to do with me. So I wanted to be a maker of something. I even at one point thought I would be a musician. I had no talent whatever. I took piano lessons for a few months, 1 year, and I remember one time the Hazard High School band came to our school and gave a concert and played band music for a while, but then played some classical selections. And I was so excited by this, and I got myself a harmonica. I was going to be a great harmonica player for about a week. But I know it was an impulse to want to externalize something that was in me. And I think many people have this, and it comes out in different ways for many people. My attention was on the writers. I was excited by Jesse Stewart and James Still as people who were writers, I guess more than I was the characters in their fiction. That came later. I think I'm influenced a lot by the teachers that I had. You know, the teachers, I've been blessed with good teachers all my life in every school I've been in. Ever since I was the student of Frank O'Connor, the great Irish short story writer, I have been a self-conscious member of the audience of the short story, exactly the way a baseball fan is a fan of baseball or basketball. You become involved with the total game, and I feel that way in relation to the short story. I can tell you who the great short story writers are and which of their stories are the best, in the same way that a baseball fan knows who the great players are and what their great games were. I think it was Mr. O'Connor who just talked about short stories and short story writers in a way that opened my eyes to a possibility of really embracing something that you could work with forever and never exhaust the possibilities of pleasure. I would hear Mr. O'Connor talk about stories by Chekhov or Turgenev in ways that it was obvious that these stories had entered him, that he had the stories in him, and that they affected him forever. And so I wanted to have that much pleasure from it. I could see that this man had drew a lot of spiritual food from this art called the short story. And it needn't be the short story. It could be the haiku. It could be bird watching. It could be anything that is there to involve you. It was while I was in the Army taking training at Fort Benning. One Saturday, I checked in on a weekend pass. I checked into a downtown hotel, and I sat down, and the story that was in front of my mind was about a boy hitchhiking home after seeing the show in town. And so over a period of 3 or 4 weekends in the Ralston Hotel in Columbus, Georgia, I wrote the early drafts of Fat Munroe. Now, this is 1961, and the story was the story went through something like 10 years of drafting and redrafting and changing and tinkering and editing and starting over again before it was ever published. Well, I have my own thoughts about Fat Munroe that I've always had, and they change as I think about him at different times, and also as I have conversation with people who've read the story. That's always a primary question in thinking about the story. My own reading always has been that he is scary, and that he is genuinely disturbing to the kid, and that there is an edge of malice in the things that he's saying and the way that he's saying them to this boy, that he has moved beyond the normal limits of an adult teasing a kid, and that he really has scared the boy. So I have that sense of him. But the real question is, does this make Fat Munroe evil? You know, and I don't think he's evil. I think that he is, maybe it's necessary for this kid to meet somebody like Fat Munroe. And in that sense, maybe Fat Munroe is doing the kid a favor by offering him an experience that he probably needs for his own growth and his own development. Another way of thinking about Fat Munroe is, how conscious is he that he has gone overboard and pushed the limits too far in his teasing of the boy. And in a way, he is just unconscious. But I don't think that we can be absolute about it. I really, and I think that's good, that we don't quite ever come to rest on this question. If somewhere I have any aspect of myself in the Fat Munroe story, then maybe in a way it's a story about a kid who has this basic attitude of trust of the world. Basically that story is set in a time when kids hitchhiked a lot, when it was totally normal that for someone to pick up a kid and give them a ride home, maybe on the assumption that probably anybody that came along would know you or know someone from your end of the county or had some recognition, so that this attitude of trust was part of the way that people related to each other, and you assumed it. It was a given. And so maybe one of the things going on, if there's something disturbing in the Fat Munroe story, it's about a boy's encounter with a moment in which he suddenly realizes he can't trust this person or the situation that he's in, and therefore he's going to be upset. I think the story Fat Munroe ends before we see the full effects of this experience upon the boy. I think the story ends with the boy still in a state of emotional upheaval, of confusion, and of frustration. And the story does not bring these feelings to rest. But I think that we have seen enough of the boy to see his native intelligence and his strength. He's tough, and he has resources. So I think the implication is there, in my reading of it anyhow, that yes, the boy will get it and take it in and let it become part of the fabric of his life and experience, and that in the end he's strengthened. It becomes something that will be usable by him someday.